In the context of Black History Month, Carib Nation will discuss the relationship between African Americans and Caribbean peoples and the contribution of Caribbean peoples to the United States of America. Stay tuned, Carib Nation is next.
When America wants to know what's happening in the Caribbean diaspora, there is one clear choice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
Both people inside and outside are
very excited about today's program.
Looking at you, I can tell that you have traveled the journey.
One television organization brings America close to the people, stories, and events that affects Caribbean life. Get close, get answers, get Carib Nation.
Black History Month is very important for African Americans, but it is also important for people of color throughout the world, people of color who have come to the United States of America and have benefited enormously from the struggles of the civil rights movement and the historical struggles of African Americans as a whole. Today in our studio, we will discuss with three eminent personalities the issue of the relationship between Caribbean peoples and African Americans, and also the contribution of Caribbean peoples here in the United States of America. We have with us in the studio today Curtis Ward, Ambassador of Jamaica to the United Nations, formerly, and he's also a Carib Nation analyst, among other hats that he wears. And we also have with us Mr. Dennis Wiggins, who is a businessman, a young dynamic businessman. And we have also with us Dr. Clarence Lucene from American University, a professor at American University. Clarence, I think it would be appropriate that as an African American, I first ask you, how did Black History Month come about?
Well, it began life actually as Negro History Week. And it was the brainchild of historian Carter G. Woodson, who, like W.B. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, other black historians had been writing about black history for many, many years, but felt that it was often lost and was not part of the American culture. And so what Carter G. Woodson wanted to do was to create a special period where the nation would remember the contributions of black Americans, but more importantly, that black Americans will remember their contributions, and that would create the kind of reaffirmation and the kind of dignity building that was very difficult to get, particularly in the period when Carter G. Woodson was writing. And it evolved in the 60s and 70s into Black History Month. And as it evolved, it also took on a broader context of not only looking at the contributions of people who had been born and raised in the history of black people in the United States, but began to draw those links that had always been there historically, but had never been popularized, but to draw the links between people of African descent from all over the world.
So it linked, not only it stretched out from African Americans to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to Europe,
to
and
Africa,
so forth, and of course originally from Africa. Dennis, I know you are very familiar with the Pan-Africanist movement. How do you complement what Dennis has just, what Professor Lucene has just said?
Yeah, Pan-Africanism was the movement to bring Caribbean people, people of African descent, and African Americans together, and the correlation between the people's social, economic, and other relations was important in the Pan-African movement. For example, if you remember Marcus Garvey and forming the UNIA around 1919.
That would be the United
Negro Improvement Association. And that was an integral part of the relationship that was establishing around that period between Caribbean people and African Americans. Remember that Garvey was operating in the United States. And so that movement actually not only popularized the civil rights struggle in the early part of the 20th century, but it also bring about the importance of that economic consciousness. So the UNIA and Garvey was important in the first part of the civil rights movement, one we remember. And his relationship with W. Du Bois was also, one has to also note.
So that was for the self-economic empowerment of African Americans.
Self-economic empowerment, correct. Self-economic empowerment of African Americans. And Garvey was coming from the Caribbean and saw the importance of African people throughout the diaspora, including African Americans, being economic empowered in that arena and environment of white domination.
So, Ambassador Ward, as former ambassador for a Caribbean country, what kind of contribution and what kind of personalities contributed to Caribbean people here in the United States, made a contribution?
Well, the history of Caribbean people here in the United States goes back actually to the Civil War. Not the Civil War, the War of Independence, led by George Washington. And it goes back in the name of one Caribbean person by the name of Samuel Francis, who actually saved George Washington's life when the British plotted to poison him. And Samuel Francis later became the steward of the first White House in an independent United States. And our history of participating throughout the African American history, the black history of America, picks up with Marcus Garvey, people like Claude McKay in the Harlem Renaissance, W.B. Du Bois, who also is of Caribbean descent, up into the modern civil rights movement, where many of the people who marched with Martin Luther King were of Caribbean descent. Harry Belafonte, who provided a lot of financing to the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King. Cleveland Robinson, who was put in charge of organizing the Civil Rights March on Washington in 1963, and on and on and on, and we can talk about some of these.
Dr. Lucien, you mentioned to me privately that you had met CLR James. Can you tell us a bit about him and Walter Rodney and link it to African Americans and the whole liberation movement in Africa?
Okay, for the audience who doesn't know, of course, CLR James was one of the preeminent historians and scholars of the 20th century, bar none. And he originally came to the United States in the 1940s.
He was from Trinidad and Tobago.
He was from Trinidad and Tobago, came in the 1940s to work with black radicals and leftists and progressive radicals in the United States. And at one point he was deported. But he was able to come back in the late 60s, early 70s, and he came back to Washington, D.C. And I was fortunate, I came around the end of the 70s, and he was teaching at what was then Federal City College, which eventually became part of UDC. And one of my greatest memories was a discussion between him and another prominent historian, Walter Rodney, who's from Guyana. And they had just an unbelievable, fascinating debate over the issue of politics in Africa and politics in the Caribbean. And it was here in Washington, D.C. The place was packed. But those two individuals have had tremendous impact on the political thought of progressives in the United States as well as around the world.
Because Rodney also wrote the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and CLR James wrote the book Black Jacobins about the Haitian Revolution.
Seminal text.
And also we had Eric Williams, who became Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who wrote a book entitled Capitalism and Slavery. So let us link a bit now, African Americans, people like Du Bois and these people, and other African Americans with the Caribbeans in Africa. What were the linkages, and how did all that contributed towards consciousness of African Americans, empowerment of African Americans, Caribbean people and Africans too?
Well, in the intellectual discourses that evolved, in part what Dennis was talking about with Pan-Africanism, but also with socialism, with nationalism, with the range of ideologies, you had contributions from around the world, from the Caribbean, from the United States, and from Africa. And all of that was important. All of that still remains important. In fact, probably one of the problems we have today is the passing on that information, because for many of us, when we were growing up in the 70s and 80s, this was our life. This is what we studied, this is what we read, and we made no distinction. When you read Walter Rodney, you read C.L.R. James, you read W.B. Du Bois, you read other people who were making contributions to the international thinking that was going on in radical black thought, including Malcolm X, who also has Caribbean heritage. And then what's interesting to me now, when you talk about black politics, in 2008, in the United States and much around the world, the buzz is around Barack Obama. But when you think about the first African American who really ran a presidential campaign, it was Shirley Chisholm in the 1970s, who's originally from the Caribbean. And so there's that linkage and those lines that continue to kind of...
There's been a continuity with a Caribbean link with African Americans and America as a whole.
Yeah, don't forget also, I mean, we're talking about politics and Caribbean African American relation. Don't forget the social cultural aspect also. Remember the rise of Rastafarianism in Jamaica and the spread to the Caribbean had tremendous influence on African American cultural milieu. For example, reggae, the birth of reggae influenced rap music. And you could see there was that direct linkage between reggae and rap music. Now, that a lot of young people don't remember that. But the pioneers of rap music in the early 80s got their influence directly from Brother Bob Marley. So there was that cultural aspect that was important in the relation between African Americans and the Caribbean. And that's important for Black History Month.
Very important. And what about the other aspects of sports and so forth, Ambassador?
Well, certainly in sports and entertainment, there have been quite a bit of input from the Caribbean in the African American community. We have sports stars like Patrick Ewing, who represented the United States on the Dream basketball team in the Olympics. We have track stars whose parents or grandparents are from the Caribbean. We have people like Tim Duncan, who is also from the Caribbean in basketball. We've had a number of baseball players. We've had just about name any sport, basically. Perhaps not hockey, but but certainly the Caribbean people have melded into the African American community very well. And you see, the thing that we must not forget is that Caribbean people in general assimilate extremely well within the African American community. And you see a Caribbean person walking down the street, you barely can make a distinction, if any. You know, and so the distinctions shouldn't be emphasized as much as we should talk about how we have collaborated and how we have worked with the African community in the civil rights movement. We were there with people like Stokely Carmichael, and I mentioned Cleveland Robinson, and I mentioned Harry Belafonte. And in today's day, we have Louis Farrakhan, we had Malcolm X. We also have had a number of entertainers, Queen Latifah, all these people.
With
in
links
politics,
to the Caribbean.
With links to the Caribbean. In politics, if you look at the right now in Congress, you have two members of Congress, Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas and Yvette Clarke from New York, who are of Caribbean roots. You have Lieutenant Governor Brown in the state of Maryland, who has Caribbean roots. You have the mayor of Washington, D.C., Mayor Fenty, who has Caribbean roots.
He does?
Oh, yes, from Barbados, and so on and so forth. So you had Colin Powell, who rose to be Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with Caribbean roots. And in his book, one of the main features of his book is writing about his Caribbean roots and how that has influenced him. And throughout, I mean, right now I guarantee you, in the political campaigns taking place, that you have people of Caribbean roots who are working in these political campaigns at very high levels.
Dr. Lucien, at the social level, there have been a lot of trade union leaders that also, with links to the Caribbean. Can you tell us a bit about at least one of them that you mentioned?
Well, this goes, there's a long, long history, and all the way back to Garvey, in fact, that there have been Caribbean activists who've been part of the labor movement, going through A. Philip Randolph, through even locally here in Washington, D.C., Josh Williams, who's been head of the Central Labor Council now for maybe 10 years. It's been a long time.
As long as I can remember.
As long as I can remember. It's been a while. So there's been that contribution. And the thing I want to add is that it's really important, as we've been talking about the individuals that have contributed, but there's also been broader, more general kind of contributions. I'm completely ignorant about popular music, but I know jazz. And jazz has a long history of Caribbean influence, not only from what we know about the 1950s with the Cubans and the influence from Tito Puente and all of that, but even going back to the history of jazz. And jazz historians now very much concede that New Orleans, where jazz was born, was really a melting pot. Part of that melting pot, a significant part of that melting pot, were people from the Caribbean. And so there's a long, more general kind of contribution, interaction, exchange that has shaped Black American culture and Black American politics that we continue to kind of uncover and to discover.
I think there's been a bit of a kind of a dialectical influence, in the sense that, in as much as Caribbean people might have had some influence here among African Americans have had some influence down in the Caribbean. For example, I recall Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, many of us growing up fed on his speeches, his great inspirational speeches. And also, in another way, we came out with political independence. We were able to win civil rights goal, perhaps in terms of time, earlier than African Americans coming out of segregation. But we came from a common kind of history of plantations and the suffering and all the inhumanity that goes with that. I think, do you think that is one of the reasons why there is this bond? And the other thing is that because we were influenced by the British and you speak English, there was this linguistic compatibility, not to deny the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the others from having contributed to. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, I'm not sure if it was Jesse Jackson, but somebody said we came over on different ships, but we all ended up in the same boat. And I think that really kind of captures it. There's, what I write about often, there's a commonality of experience that unites us. So as much as we may look alike, as much as we may have adopted the language, it's really that we all came through a common prism of oppression. And we recognize that in each other, and what that has meant in terms of what our lives have been, what our histories have been, and how we've struggled to overcome that, and how collectively we have to move forward. I think that's been at the core of what's really been a bond between people of African descent in the United States and people of African descent from the Caribbean and elsewhere. And I think that's really the heart of the linkages.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. But as early as the 1880s and 1890s, David Walker, the Walker Appeal, was appealing for solidarity between African Americans in the early struggle and Caribbean people. The Walker Appeal was a leaflet published by David Walker, a free man during that time, and he was directly appealing for that solidarity. So that the struggle that David Walker was waging during that period was influencing the colonial movement to some extent in the Caribbean.
The anti-colonial movement.
The anti-colonial movement.
Now, identity, go ahead.
And well, see, he reminds me, because then you also have the Haitian Revolution.
That's right.
Talk a bit about that.
The African Americans absolutely understood what that was all about. And this was at the end of the 1700s. The U.S. had literally just been born. It just created itself as a state, but a state that still had people who were enslaved. And so the slave revolution, the rebellion that happened in Haiti, was meaningful not just to the people who were ruling the United States and the fear that that sent, but to people who were enslaved in this country who also understood what that meant.
Was Frederick Douglass representative to Haiti for the U.S. at some point?
In the 1870s and 1880s.
Exactly. So that's a very interesting phenomenon. Right. Now, one of the things about Caribbean people and also African Americans, from our knowledge of both histories, is this search for identity. Who are we as a Caribbean people? Who are African Americans? What is your view on that in terms of the discussion and the debate between Africans in Africa, African Americans, and Caribbean people? What was that debate? What is that debate? Where is that debate now today?
Well, I think from the African American perspective, it's an ongoing one. Earlier when I talked about, originally Black History Month was called Negro History Week, that reflected a period when black people were called Negro. And there have been other periods we've been called Afro-Americans, we've been called Africans, and the common usage today is pretty much African Americans. But all of those labels, all of those titles reflect us trying to struggle through what has it meant to grow and live and be in this country, and what has that meant in our relationship with other people of African descent around the world. And so I think you're right, you're absolutely correct that these identity issues surge themselves time and time again, because the status and the status of where we find ourselves, we still have to struggle with issues that those outside of our community don't.
And today there is a big problem between African American leadership and the communities. There's a bit of the link between, like, for example, the generation of the civil rights leaders and the younger people. How does knowledge about all these things, about Pan-Africanism, the linkages with the Caribbean, with Africa, and so forth, how, in your opinion, Dr. Lusan, this is going to reach down to this new generation of African Americans?
Well, I hope the next generation will take on the responsibilities that the generations before have taken. Frantz Fanon, I think it was, says each generation has to find its mission, and then either you fulfill it or you don't. And so for the current generation, they have to address the issues that exist today that face, and I think they're broader issues, that face not only people of African descent, but issues that really face the entire world. And I think we're starting to see some degree of rising to that occasion, because there are many young black people all over the world who are stepping up. When we look at, for example, black people who are winning Nobel Prizes, or we're looking at black people who are making inventions in science, or we're looking at possibility of a black president of the United States, we're seeing virtually unheard of steps that are being taken to address all of the issues that we have in front of us by a generation of people who have a very different kind of way of looking at the world than the earlier generations. And so it is time to pass on the torch.
And Dennis, what do you view as the main challenge for building a stronger relationship between African Americans and the Caribbean diaspora here in the United States?
Challenge. I don't particularly see it as a challenge, but I believe one of the things, the civil rights, I see a gap in the civil rights movement in the 60s and the young people today. From my own perspective, there's that morality gap. You see, the civil rights movement offers some challenges to African Americans. There's this hip-hop generation that don't have those same challenges. And so there's a diversion in terms of morality. And that's a problem that I have with this young generation not connecting enough with what took place in the 60s. And so that is influencing the Caribbean and Caribbean youth also in their, you see, reggae music influenced rock music, but there's a cycle now. Rock music is now influencing reggae music. And so And so, because of that disconnect between that morality aspect of it, I'm talking about certain language that you find in rap music, the labeling of women and things like that.
There's an allegation of a denigration of women.
Right.
Ambassador, apart from the cultural challenge that Dennis underlines, how can Caribbean people get closer and build stronger links, as was done by generations before in this new time, with African Americans, which is very important?
Well, let me try to bring it into context, because there has been a gap between the civil rights movement and those leaders of the civil rights era and today's younger generation of African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans and Caribbean Americans, or whatever we want to call ourselves. There's a huge gap. And I believe this is being shown right now in the political campaign that's taking place. There are a lot of young African Americans that are energized in this election campaign, whether for one candidate or another, but one candidate in particular. And you find that the African American leadership is not with them. As a matter of fact, the African American leadership is leading, but nobody following. And this is going to create some new dynamics in the African American community in the years ahead. This election campaign is going to create some new dynamics in the African American community. And Caribbean people are part of that whole dynamics, because we are a part of the African American community for all intents and purposes. There are also economic factors now.
How many Caribbean people are now of the Caribbean diaspora reside in the U.S.?
Well, the 2006 Census Bureau has a little over 2.5 million people of West Indian descent. But I personally believe it's an undercount, because there are many people of West Indian descent who share other nationalities that may not be identified as of Caribbean descent during the census count. But 2.5 million is significant.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with Carib Nation today. It is very clear that people of color from all over the world, as I've said in the beginning, owe very much to the struggles of African Americans here in the United States, the struggle against segregation, civil rights, and so forth. And this is a very powerful country, and African Americans are an integral part, and Caribbean diaspora who are living here now, of the most powerful country on earth. And therefore, we have to strengthen that alliance and build a relationship between the Caribbean diaspora and African Americans. I am Paul Nehru, Tennessee, for Carib Nation.